Comic artist Steve Ditko was found dead in his apartment on June 29, 2018. He apparently had died within the previous 2 days, and he was 90 years old. Steve Ditko was an intensely private individual and felt that his work should speak for itself, and therefore gave very few interviews. I believe there are only 3 to 4 public photographs of him in public existence. Like comic book legend Jack Kirby, who also worked for Marvel during the same formative period, Steve Ditko had a distinctive visual style to comics that is uniquely his own. And like Jack Kirby, it's a style that I really didn't begin to appreciate until I got older. He is best known among comic fans as the man who co-created Spider-Man and Doctor Strange with Stan Lee. But there was a lot more to him than just that. Steve Ditko studied comic art under Golden Age Batman artist Jerry Robinson at the Cartoonist and Artist School in New York City. He began his professional career in 1953, working at the Joe Simon and Jack Kirby studio. It was during this time that he began a long on-again, off-again association with Charlton Comics, where he co-created Captain Atom, and in later years he would also create The Question and the modern-day rendition of the Blue Beetle for Charlton Comics. All 3 of these characters would provide inspiration for Alan Moore's seminal graphic novel, The Watchmen. More on that in a moment. In 1955, he would begin working for Atlas Comics, who would later become known as Marvel Comics, and it would be there that he would help create the 2 works that he is best known for. There are a number of differing accounts of how Spider-Man was created, and I've read them all. But I feel pretty confident stating that Stan Lee created the name and had the concept that the character would be a teenager that other teenagers could identify with. He initially asked longtime collaborator Jack Kirby to come up with the look and was not satisfied, so he asked Ditko to give it a whirl. And it was Steve Ditko who created the look of Spider-Man as we know the character today, dressing him in a costume that not only covered his entire body, but his entire face as well. Something unusual to comic heroes of the time. Spider-Man would be credited as written by Stan Lee and drawn by Steve Ditko, but this could be misleading. Oftentimes, artists would plot the story, draw it, and then turn it over to Stan Lee, who would write the dialogue and captions. And most comic historians will say that this was the case with Spider-Man. It is well known that Ditko had to keep fighting for a credit as co-plotter for Spider-Man, a credit which he finally in time did receive. I stated earlier that there was a lot more to Steve Ditko than Spider-Man, but even if Spider-Man was all that the artist was ever involved with creating, it would have been enough. I oftentimes refer to Spider-Man as the first revisionist superhero, long before that term was ever even coined. He wasn't a big-name newspaper reporter, or a millionaire playboy, or a test pilot, or a career scientist. He was an awkward, alienated teenager who had to struggle to help his Aunt May pay the rent. He was bullied at school, and his superhero activities would oftentimes plague him with bad luck and personal misfortune. Spider-Man was a complete reinvention of the superhero genre, and I'm not sure if anybody realized it at the time. Then came Doctor Strange, where Steve Ditko really began to stretch his artistic muscles. With its surreal and psychedelic art, Steve Ditko became the Salvador Dali of modern comics, and I was glad to see that some of his aesthetics did get translated into the recent Marvel Studios motion picture. For DC Comics, he created the Creeper, Hawk and the Dove, and Shade the Changing Man. But for the most part, comic fans know him for his run on the original Spider-Man series, and of course, his work on Doctor Strange. But it's in his independently published and more personal work, and thus less well-known work, that Steve Ditko really shined as an artist. Ditko was a huge follower of Ayn Rand's objectivist philosophy. Now, for the record, I have little or no real interest or connection to his political, philosophical beliefs, but I cannot deny that it's when he asserts these beliefs in his art that he is at his strongest as an artist. It's in his personal work that he created Mr. A, who was in many respects a further extension of his previous creation, The Question. Steve Ditko, and by extension Mr. A, is a character who believes in absolutes with no gray areas. These stories do preach at you, which is why I'm sure most of it has not really connected with mainstream comics fans. In spite of the preaching, there is just something appealing that I find about a character who believes in such extreme moral absolutes, even though my own rationality tells me otherwise. When Alan Moore wrote and co-created the Watchmen graphic novel for DC Comics, he stated that the character Rorschach was based on Mr. A and his predecessor, the Question. A character who believes in extreme absolutes, Rorschach refuses to compromise his beliefs, even in the face of death, or the deaths of millions. In a recent interview, Alan Moore stated that when Ditko was asked about the Rorschach character, Ditko stated, "He's like Mr. A, except that he's insane." One of my personal favorites of Steve Ditko's independently produced works, and a book that I still marvel at to this day, is the Ditko Public Service Package, originally published in the early 90s. In the Public Service Package, Steve Ditko takes on the comics industry, its movers, its shakers, the writers, the artists, its fans, and its critics, and the medium itself. And he does it all with reckless abandon and glee. In the Public Service Package, comic pages cry out and explode with words, and panels melt right in front of you. It's like a long, extended, nightmarish editorial cartoon on 5 hits of acid. And no, Steve Ditko did not take drugs. You don't just read this book, you experience it. Passion explodes with every panel and pen stroke. I don't have to agree with any of Ditko's criticisms, philosophies, or beliefs to be able to appreciate the passion in his work. Like I said before, I can understand why a lot of his more personal work just doesn't really click with most comic fans. But I think it's a shame that in his lifetime, he received so little accolades for his most popular of works. Rest in peace, Steve Ditko. I may not personally believe in your philosophy of absolutes, but I absolutely believe that you were a true auteur within the comic book industry. This is TJR. Thank you so much for watching. If you like what I do and you want to see me make more videos like this, please be sure to click like and subscribe and share these videos with your friends. Thank you so much for your support. Bye-bye.